that mean?
I think we're live. Kahoʻokahi.
Oh,
Okay, it looks like we are. So, let's get started with a pule. E kuka ko I ka pule. E o mau kiaʻi mai ka pō mai, e nana ia mai ke au puni o kākou. Mai luna lalo, mai kahi kihi a kahi kihi, mai kahi kina ke komohana, mai ka uka ke kai, mai loko a waho. Kiaʻi ia, mālama ia, e pale aku I nā hoʻopili kia ana I ko kākou nohona au puni ana. A mama, ua noa.
Mahalo.
Mahalo Kahoʻokahi. Welcome everyone and Kalamai for the delay. Had some technical difficulties on my end, but we're really excited for you to join us tonight. We have a really vibe conversation that we're going to have tonight with our dear friends at NDN Collective and HULI, KAHEA board members. And we're going to be talking about specifically the LANDBACK campaign, how Hawaii fits in, why we're talking about it today on La Ku'oko'a, and how Hawaii can tie into that campaign and how we can both be supported and support the campaign. Just so you know, we will be taking questions through our different forums, and we'll be saving those for the end. So we're going to talk briefly about what is the LANDBACK campaign, where did it start, what is it about. We're going to have CEO and President Nick Tilton from NDN Collective and LANDBACK Campaign Director Crystal Tubles, two of our dear friends. They're going to talk about that campaign. And Andre Perez is going to talk about what that relationship is to Hawaii. From then, we're going to have Kahoʻokahi Kanuha talk about the background of La Ku'oko'a, the context and what we're doing here today. We'll have this distinguished Jon Osorio, Dr. Jon Osorio, talking about some of the history of land tenure in Hawaii and what does that have to do with LANDBACK. Followed by Shelley Muneoka, a longtime advocate for Native Hawaiian rights, fighter, defender of our sacred spaces on Mauna Kea. And we'll talk specifically about how LANDBACK applies to Mauna Kea. At the end, we'll follow up with what can we do, where's our next steps, how can we move forward. So with that, I'd like to introduce Nick and Crystal, give you guys the floor, and just want to say that I'm honored to be an NDN Collective board member and really excited to serve on such a progressive organization. Mahalo. Nick and Crystal?
Actually, I was going to introduce Nick and Crystal and our relationship with them, I think. Okay. So I'll do that. Real quick, aloha mai kako. This is Andre Perez coming to you live here with NDN President and Founder Nick Tilson and LANDBACK Campaign Director Crystal Tubles. And really just want to introduce them briefly and our relationship with them and how we came to be aloha aina with them and how we have relationships around indigenous struggle, resistance, as Kanaka Hawaiian people and as Lakota people, and how we're working together for common goals around social justice, sovereignty, self-determination, etc. Real quick, I'll keep this brief. We've been working with NDN, Nick Tilson, and Crystal for years. We've done work from Standing Rock. Prior to Standing Rock, we worked with Crystal with IP3, Indigenous Peoples Power Project. We met at an action camp. And we've done work with NDN and members of NDN collectively from many places: Colorado, Florida, South Dakota, North Dakota, Tennessee, Washington, D.C., Oakland. And so we've really put time into developing our relationship. Some years ago, Nick and I were talking, and I realized that our kupuna, our parents' generation, the generation before us, had strong relationships with, Indian country, so to speak, from people like Russell Means, John Trudell, and many other native leaders on Turtle Island had relationships with people like Kekuni Blaisdell, Kawaipuna Prijin, Bumpy Kanahele. So we have relationships with old and long-standing relationships with our Turtle Island brothers and sisters, and we were kind of losing those relationships as the generation before us, was passing on, slowly passing away, passing on. So it's been very important for myself and Nick Tilson. We've talked about this a lot, and Crystal, about maintaining that relationship, keeping that bridge between our two communities in shared struggle and resistance, keeping that bridge strong. Because collectively, solidarity means that we're stronger together. We're stronger when we recognize each other's struggle and resistance, and we recognize that we have a common goal and that we have a common oppressor, and we have common issues that we're facing together. So we've been working together for, about 5 years, a solid 5 years, and really working hard. And I'll wrap this up by saying, when we occupied the Mauna and we created the Pu'uhonua o Pu'uhuluhulu, it was, a lot of people don't know this, but NDN was one of the very first organizations to respond with support for Pu'uhuluhulu, for our Mauna struggle. Crystal Tubals flew into Kona within the first week of our occupation, and she hitchhiked from Kona up to the Mauna and stayed for about 3 weeks, almost a month. And Nick, president of NDN, was on the phone with us a lot during that time. Immediately launched a fundraiser, and NDN got us $20,000 right within the first week before any other orgs were supporting us. NDN got us money to purchase the tents and the supplies that eventually became our kitchen, became part of our kupuna camp, etc. NDN also funded our solar trailers and sent up two Navajo from Arizona, right? Solar technicians. NDN sent up two brothers to help us build the solar trailers, and they funded the solar trailers so that we would have power, off-grid power up on the Mauna. So we really want to mahalo NDN. They've been really supportive. They know our struggle, and they're there. They've been there for us. And also, in closing, one last thing that NDN, the work that they do and the services that they provide to the community includes us, includes Hawaii. So we're able to apply for all of their grant processes, their different fellowships, different funding opportunities that will come out of NDN, includes Hawaii. Hawaii, early on when Nick was designing NDN, I made a pitch to him to have a regional board member to represent the Pacific, Hawaii, and the other occupied territories, including American Samoa, Guam, and Nick immediately obliged and was supportive of that. So we have, Hawaii has a board seat on the NDN board. Camille Kalama is our first board member, and we're really excited to be working with NDN and to build with NDN. Mahalo nui. I want to hand it over now to Nick and Crystal to talk about LANDBACK. What is LANDBACK? How does this campaign work, and how can Hawaii fit into the LANDBACK campaign? Mahalo. And aloha, Nick and Crystal.
Aloha and Hamada Kiaʻi, Nick Tilson, Amachiapi, Trontea Wachte, Napetu Zapalo. I greet you in my Lakota language, and it's honored to be with each and every one of you here today. give Crystal opportunity to introduce yourself before I introduce NDN a little bit more.
Peveshev relatives, Mene Wostat, Nanehav. My name's Crystal Tubles. I'm Oglala Lakota, Northern Cheyenne. I'm calling in from the beautiful Black Hills right now, and I'm the director of the LANDBACK campaign right now. Thank you.
Yeah, so a little bit. I mean, a little bit about NDN Collective before we jump into LANDBACK. You know, NDN Collective. NDN is just slang, straight up slang for like Indian. You know, like used to say when the aunties would all get together and say, "I want to go over I want to go to my auntie's house so we can speak Indian together." And so you know we wanted to just and then as like you know social media and 90s hip hop took off, everybody started using NDN as a short just for Indian. So we kind of claimed it like and owned it and just decided to create an organization around it. And you know some of the things that NDN Collective does is we wanted to change the conditions in which the way in which indigenous determination was supported. Almost always our indigenous struggles are underfunded, under-resourced, you know, given less media attention, given less support. Our work and our people are invisibilized a lot of the time. And so we built the Indian Collective as a movement infrastructure organization to both provide funding, communications and narrative support, resources for frontline organizing, and to continue to do frontline organizing ourselves in our areas, and sort of a really holistic approach, holistic approach to building indigenous power. And one of the things that was fundamental in the creation of NDN Collective was that we didn't want to recognize the colonial borders that divide indigenous people. And in not recognizing the colonial borders that divide indigenous people, it inherently makes our work international. It inherently makes our work, you know, international and across these borders, especially the colonial borders. And and when we were thinking about the creation of this organization, it was important to us, you know, because of these natural relationships that brother Andre was talking about, that we make sure that you know all the relatives in Hawaii were not second. They're not thought about second, but they're thought about just the same as everybody else, as the indigenous people's movement that we wanted to continue to support. And so, you know, Indian Collective does grant making, we do lending, we do capacity building, we do organizing on the front lines, and and we're happy to show up and support. And you know we do frontline organizing in the communities that we're from, and then when we you know support other indigenous nations, a lot of times we're behind the scenes supporting, whether it be resourcing, talking, mentorship, you know, coming up with strategies, all these different ways, because fundamentally at the foundation, at the center of NDN's work is investing into the self-determination of indigenous people that are doing the work of defend, develop, and decolonize. And out of this work, the LANDBACK campaign was sort of born and grew. And you know, the first thing that I want to say about the LANDBACK campaign, before I let Crystal jump into it, is that we recognize that the LANDBACK movement is a movement that nobody owns, that nobody controls, um, and and that it's lived in the hearts and minds of indigenous people everywhere since the time that our land was stolen from us. And not only our land, but everything else that was stolen as a result of the taking of our land and the colonization of our people. And so this movement is a movement to revitalize our languages, our culture, our ceremonies, our lifeways, and get our land back in the process and shift the power for our people. And NDN Collective is honored, you know, to be hosting this campaign. And you know, the campaign, is really focused on this idea that there's an existing LANDBACK movement that is in all these different places, and our role is to resource, to connect, to amplify, and to politicize the growing land back movement. And so we're really excited about some of the work that is, that where that is all heading. And I love it because we're able to fight on the front lines in our community and support indigenous people that are fighting on the front lines for their land and for their people and for the future of their nations, just like the relatives here from Hawaii. So that's a little bit about NDN Collective, a little bit about the Land Back campaign. Crystal can kind of expand on that and get into some more details about the Land Back campaign.
Thanks, Nick. So the Land Back campaign, as we talk about it and as we share this, it's just exactly what Nick said in terms of we're really stepping into a long legacy of organizing in work and energy and sacrifice that our predecessor and organizers and ancestors, sometimes in some cases gave their lives for, right? And so it's really an honor to be stepping into the Land Back movement in this way. But the way that we talk about it when it comes to NDN Collective, and the way very specifically through NDN Collective that we're stepping into this work, is really in two parts. There's first part is the traditional campaign in terms of a goal and a start date and an end date, right? And that's really the demand to close Mount Rushmore and to return all public lands in the Black Hills back to their original stewards. And so that is first and foremost what our campaign is and the cornerstone for how we move forward. And the second part is really around functioning as like a mechanism, right? So we're through NDN Collective functioning as a mechanism to connect, coordinate, resource, amplify, and politicize land back organizing that is happening all across Turtle Island and beyond, right? Into our relatives to the north, to the south, Pacific Islands. We're really, really leaning into the idea that land back is this narrative that is almost all encompassing, because as we know, as indigenous peoples to these lands, as original stewards to these lands, is that everything about us and how we move in our day-to-day lives and how we move in this world is based on our relationship to the land. And so because of that, that is what makes this so strong, right? And so that's the way that we're thinking about the campaign through NDN Collective, is really in those two parts. And the traditional campaign, having the Black Hills be that central point, is really reviving a fight that has been ongoing for generations, and really able to like catalyze off of the momentum from July 3rd, the action on July 3rd, when we prevented trespassing on our traditional lands and into the sacred Black Hills. And so that was kind of the catalyst that moved us into this. And we've been able to build deep relationships with many different movement spaces around land back because of the momentum that was already built, with the Black Lives Matter and Movement for Black Lives tearing down colonial structures and statues all across Turtle Island. And we were able to really move from that and focus on Mount Rushmore, which is, the ultimate shrine to white supremacy, right? In the heart of this, the world's greatest political and military power. And so for us, it was an important moment, but we definitely honor all of the work that led into this moment that really catalyzed the Land Back campaign and moved us forward in this way. And I always forget to mention, so I want to make sure that I make sure to focus on this, but I forget to mention our demands. So we have very clear demands with the Land Back campaign and for how we work with folks and how we move forward and how our work is guided. And the demands are dismantle white supremacy, right? So, and dismantle the institutions that continue to keep original stewards away from the land. So like National Park Services, public lands, and and all of the institutions that separate us, right? So we're saying dismantle those and defund white supremacy, focusing on the mechanisms that enforce the separation of us from the land, right? And so when we're talking about that, we're talking about the military industrial complex, we're talking about the police, we're talking about the border patrol, we're talking about ICE, and all of them have historically been the enforcing mechanisms that do keep us from the land and keep us separated. And then the third one is consent. And so we're really focusing on moving us from from an era of consultation in making decisions that impact Native lives and that impact our lives and impact the land without us, and moving us into an era of free and prior informed consent, true free and prior informed consent. And the last is simply return, just meaning return Indigenous lands to Indigenous hands. And so those are our 4 demands: is dismantle, defund, consent, and return. But that's kind of a basic overview, and I'm sure we'll be able to look at many different aspects of the campaign as we further this conversation. Thank you.
Crystal,
And I want
go
to
ahead.
add something real quick too. Like, you know, these demands are powerful. I mean, we're talking about the dismantling of the system that has, you know, taken our lands and destroyed many things amongst Indigenous people. And when we talk about moving from a policy era, an entire policy era of the way that Indigenous people have been dealt with, um, you know, in the U.S. system, we have this system of consultation, right? They have to consult us before they do the terrible shit to our land and do the terrible things to our people. And so when we're talking about moving from a political era of consultation to a political era of consent, it means that they'll have to get our consent on the things that affect the lands and lives of our people. And that's powerful because if you think about all the different things, whether you're talking about education, you're talking about land issues, you're talking about industries and pipelines and all these things, if they need to get our consent, the whole, not just the Indigenous world, but many of the lands in which Indigenous people have say so over through that process will be dramatically impacted. And so we're not talking about incremental change here. We're talking about long-term systemic change that changes the entire parameters in which Indigenous people are even dealt with by colonial governments. And really, it's leaning into the liberation of our people, into the liberation of our lands. And that's, you know, to me, that's like the stuff that gets me fired up about this campaign in this work, because now we're changing the entire dynamics of the way in which governments and corporations and people deal with our people. So I just wanted to, you know, just add that on there and say how fired up I am to be talking on this day of liberation for Hawaii.
Also, just hearing Nick share too, I do want to make it really clear too. I feel like people always ask, what do you mean when you say land back? And I am kind of so immersed in the campaign at some points that I forget to even talk about that, of like, we are talking about literal returning of land, right? Like, first and foremost, we're not talking about land acknowledgement. We are saying return the land. And so in return it back to the stewardship of the original stewards, right? And also, land back represents the reclamation of everything that we were separated from and everything that was stripped from us because we were removed from the land, right? So our songs, our ceremonies, our languages, our ability to harvest and to grow medicines and harvest medicines and to hunt and to feed ourselves, all of those things and so much more is based on our relationship to the land. And so, just to name those things, that's what makes land back so powerful, because it is very spiritually based, right? It's based in our belief systems, it's based in who we are as people. And even, you know, for where I'm from, Northern Cheyenne, you know, it's, we have songs that tell us, you know, where it says like, am I the land, am I the land, and at the end, like, I am the land. And like, and I hold that as I go into this work, and I know so many people doing land back organizing hold that same feeling and hold those same prayers as we go into this work. But I just wanted to make sure to add in that component and to name that this is spiritually guided work, right? And as we move into that, it's important to acknowledge those pieces. But I just wanted to make sure I add that, because I kind of get ahead of myself sometimes.
Mahalo, Crystal. I wanted to ask a question for Nick and Crystal in terms of the vision for land back. Because when I hear land back, you know, there's all kind of ideas. And to me, the ability to imagine innovative and sort of creative approaches to this is important. but not only public lands, but we have a lot of we have the same issue: sacred lands that are part of so-called public lands under so-called fake state jurisdiction, etc. But then there's also private land and private wealth, right? And we know that oftentimes settlers' private land and private wealth is built upon our lands. And so just the concept of land back has got me thinking about, what if there's, because we've seen this happen in Hawaii, what if there's a settler, a Haole settler, or anybody, not Hawaiian here in Hawaii, who maybe they don't have any heirs. They don't have anyone to leave their land or house to. The idea came to me about a land back trust, where we've seen examples where there were certain Haole settlers here in Hawaii who loved Hawaiian culture and Hawaiian people, and they passed away and they left their land or some of their wealth to Hawaiian organizations. So that got me thinking about a land back trust or a land back fund, where maybe we can either get land back by way of private ownership, or by way of donated funds to purchase land back. Just being creative here. For us, we're in, as Skippy says, a good friend of ours, poet, musician, they got democracy. We got survive. So how do we be creative about that survival? Any thoughts on that? Land back trust fund, land back, just a land back fund for cash money or whatever. What's your thoughts there?
I'll take that one. I live in this space a lot, so I'm jumping in on this one. It's all hands on deck, right? This movement is about getting indigenous lands back into indigenous hands at all cost and every means necessary. And I'll be straight up, like NDN Collective, it doesn't matter to us whether we get the title to a land or whether we get rich money from folks to buy land, or we've liberated capital from these places who got rich off the stealing of our land in the first place. NDN Collective is about 3 years old, 2.5 years old, and a big part of our work has been focused on liberating capital, liberating dollars from white-led institutions that have gained their wealth off of the stealing of indigenous people's lands and off of the forced enslaved labor of our black brothers and sisters. And so I got no qualms about, getting land, getting resources and money and millions of dollars raised from these white-led institutions, and then using that money strategically to buy land. In fact, we've been doing that. NDN Collective has built a model and a mechanism to do that. We've bought land in the path of pipelines strategically. We've bought land in the past of these different places. So at the same time, we're talking about political strategies to get land back. Hell yeah, we'll use financial strategies too. And I think that in Hawaii, you got a lot of squatters on the land up there, who came into your territory, who if they ended up there, they got quite a bit of wealth there too. And so I think that to explore different mechanisms, and to me it's like either or, sort of all hands on deck. And I think that it's actually fundamental that we have multiple approaches to doing this, because the reality is there is a part of this work that is about reparations, and the root word of reparations is about repair. And if this country and if the nations all over want to eventually begin to repair its relationship with indigenous people, it ain't happening without land back. And so we got to have all tools available to us to be able to achieve that, whether it be political means or financial means. So if we want to start a fund, for Hawaii to reclaim their lands, sign me up. Wherever that's going to be at, I'm down, and NDN Collective will be down to throw down on something like that. and we can share our struggle. We can share our strategies and ways that we're doing that here at NDN Collective, because we're actively doing that at the same time we're exploring political means of getting land back. So yeah, I'm all about that idea.
That's great. Mahalo, Nick. That's, for us, I think a lot of us feel the same way. Like, how do we be creative and innovative in getting land back? We got a similar slogan: keep Hawaiian lands in Hawaiian hands, and we also want to keep Hawaiian hands in Hawaiian lands. Yeah, growing food. Right on. I want to pass it back to Camille to facilitate our next segment. Mahalo.
Mahalo to all of you. I think that a lot of the things that you said are things we say all the time, and absolutely number one issue for our people, for our lahui, is aina, is our land. Like you said, everything that was taken when the land was taken, it's about our ability to survive, really, as a people. And so one of the things we're going to talk about today, we're going to have Kahoʻokahi Kanuha talk about why we are discussing these issues today. What is the context? Why is today important, and why are we celebrating it? Kahoʻokahi?
Aloha nui kākou.
Aloha.
Mahalo ke hui ana. Ma keia la kulaia nui, keia la kamahao, keia la hauʻoli o ka la hui Hawaiʻi, ka la kuʻokoʻa. Mahalo everybody for joining us. Mahalo Nick and Crystal for being here with us and providing us this opportunity to connect and reconnect, especially on this day as it relates to land back and la kuʻokoʻa. And so today, November 28th, is what is known in Hawaii as La Kuʻokoʻa. In English, we would call it Hawaiian Independence Day. This is the day that Hawaii was officially recognized as a sovereign independent nation state, the first non-European nation state in the world to be recognized by the world powers, to be admitted into, the so-called family of nations through the signing of the Anglo-French Proclamation on this day, November 28th, 1843. And so just a quick review of this day. This day really starts in the 1839, 1840s as 1840 as Hawaii is seen the seizing of land throughout the Pacific, but even here in Hawaii we see our own issues here in Hawaii. There's a 1839 incident with a French captain, Laplace, who comes into Hawaii, makes demands of the king, and forces the king into signing a treaty that he otherwise would not be signing, and leaves him in a state of kind of embarrassment. And so as a means to avoid this type of incident from happening again and Hawaii being controlled by outside foreign powers, King Kamehameha III, Kauikeoli, along with his advisors, they develop a plan to send off some diplomats to the United States, to Great Britain, and to France to secure the recognition of Hawaii's independence by the world powers at that time, to ensure our safety and our protection from these outside influences and demands. And so in 1842, 3 individuals are sent off from the Hawaiian kingdom. A Hawaiian, a chiefly friend of the king, Timoteo Ha'alilio, along with William Richards, who was an American missionary turned kingdom official, and Sir George Simpson, who was involved in the Hudson Bay Company. And the 3 of them leave in 1842 on their mission to secure independence. And they go separately. Simpson heads off on his own, and Timoteo Ha'alilio and William Richards go together. And from Hawaii, they leave. They head to Mexico. They land in Mexico and they jump on the back of mules and they ride across Mexico for 900 miles to Veracruz. When they reach Veracruz, they get on a ship and they sail from Veracruz to New Orleans. And upon their arrival in New Orleans, they head up by way of the mail route to Washington, D.C. And they're able to get a meeting with Daniel Webster, Secretary of State of the United States of America at that time. And throughout their conversations and the meetings they're able to have with the American representatives, they receive a letter later on that year from Daniel Webster of the United States of America, saying that America continues to recognize Hawaii as an independent nation, and there's no need. They see no need at that time to recognize it formally through a treaty, and so they take that as a sign of good progress. There is independence recognized. It's not through a treaty, but it's recognized, and so they move on because they have plans to meet up with Simpson in England at the beginning of 1843. And this recognition from America is coming at the end of 1842. And so Timoteo Ha'alilio and Richards, they head off to England. Now, meanwhile, while our diplomats are out doing their thing to secure recognition and to prevent the type of incidents that happened in Hawaii in 1839 from happening again, while they're out doing that, the same kind of incident, actually, and an intensified incident, takes place in Hawaii, with a British war captain, George Paulette, and he is the captain of the HBMS Carysfort, and he comes to Hawaii based on a land dispute that's taking place between the Hawaiian government and the British consul, Richard Charlton. And so he leaves and he heads off to Mexico, actually, and meets up with Paulette and his advisor, Admiral Thomas, and he explains the situation that's taking place in Hawaii, the fact that his claim to land is not being recognized by the government, and so on and so forth. And so Paulette is sent to Hawaii to investigate, and he arrives in Hawaii in February of 1843, and he immediately begins to make these ridiculous and unmeetable demands on Kauikeoli, King Kamehameha III. And eventually King Kamehameha III is forced to cede Hawaii to this warship captain, George Paulette. And this takes place on February 25th, 1843. And through the work of Timoteo Ha'alilio and William Richards on their trip, heading through England and France, as they meet up with another Haole American from Hawaii who's sent off in assistance, JFB Marshall, they begin to negotiate the return of Hawaii from Paulette to King Kamehameha III. Now, while they're doing this, actually, Admiral Thomas receives word from Charlton through his efforts to reach there, and he sends Paulette to investigate, and he comes in and does all those things. I'm sorry, Admiral Thomas comes in July of 1843 to investigate what happened with Paulette, because he got word of what took place. And so he comes in and he immediately returns Hawaii to King Kamehameha III. He recognizes that Paulette was sent just to investigate and not to take all powers and authority of the British Crown upon himself. And so immediately the land is returned and restored to the Hawaiian Kingdom, to Kauikeoli. And this is known as La Ho'iho'i'ea, Sovereignty Restoration Day, which happens on July 31st, 1843. So now the Hawaiian flag flies again in Hawaii. King Kamehameha has control over his government and his kingdom, but we're still waiting recognition of our independence from France and Great Britain. And this is achieved, again, through the efforts of Timoteo Ha'alilio and William Richards and Sir George Simpson, through the signing of the Anglo-French Proclamation on this day, November 28th, 1843, at the Court of London, that provided Hawaii with written documentation between two nation states that we had equal status to those like America, France, and Great Britain, and that we would have, this sovereignty and this independence, and that our independence would not be infringed upon by these world powers. And so that was celebrated in Hawaii as national independence, as a national holiday. Obviously, we get to the overthrow in 1893 and the illegal annexation of Hawaii in 1898, and we'll cover that a little bit. But even through those times, even post-overthrow, La Ku'oko'a, Hawaiian Independence Day, is continued to be celebrated in the Hawaiian Kingdom. And we see accounts of it, even right after the overthrow in 1893, we see it up until 1896. You see it in 1900. You see it in 1911. You see these events that are continued to be held and continue to be celebrated. And in fact, even to this day, we continue to celebrate La Ku'oko'a, even though we live under an illegal and prolonged occupation by the United States of America. I think what's important as we wrap this section up, why it's important for us to continue to recognize and to celebrate La Ku'oko'a today is because in 1893, I feel very, very confident saying that Kanaka and Hawaiians of that time knew they were independent. They knew what they were. They simply needed the other world powers to recognize them as such, to recognize them as what they already knew themselves to be. And I believe that it's our kuleana to have that same type of perspective today, that we are independent. We are a sovereign people. These are our lands. This is our country. We've never given it up. And to talk about the language we're talking about, we have never consented to the taking of our lands, of our country, of our sovereignty. And so we are still independent. We are still sovereign, and we must think of ourselves that way, so that when independence is restored to Hawaii and to our government, to our kingdom, it's not anybody telling us something that we don't already know. It's simply them acknowledging and agreeing that what we know and what we have always known, they also recognize as well. So independence doesn't come from somebody else. Independence comes from within ourselves. We create it, we establish it, we live it, and it's up to others to recognize that within us.
Mahalo, Kaho'okahi. One last question about that section. You mentioned why it's important to celebrate these holidays and why we need to remember these things. Can you just say one more bit about the importance of remembering that we're independent, and how does that connect specifically to the land that was lost? Because it's going to tie into our next section that we'll talk about with Jon. But really briefly, if you can just do that.
Yeah, I know Jon's going to jump into that. I think really what's important about La Ku'oko'a is we talk about the illegal overthrow a lot, and how that was an illegal taking of what was actually ours. But this was the ticket in, right? We go back to this. This establishes us as a sovereign, independent nation state who has their own governing system, their own governing structure, and our own land tenure system. We have our own, we have private land ownership. We have right from 18 or after 1843, as we get into the mahele, which I'm sure Jon will cover again. We have things like fee simple and allodial title. We have crown lands and government lands that continue to be recognized today, and these different classifications of lands and the rights that Kanaka or the Ho'āina have to these lands continue to complicate American occupation in Hawaii to this day. And so, the fact that Hawaii again was recognized as a legitimate sovereign nation state by the powers of the world puts us in a different category. Our argument is not just that, that we were here first and that we were here for a long time and that we have genealogical connections to this place and that my great 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 grandfather lived here. We have all of that, but we also have the political and legal framework that fits into what is accepted and acknowledged by the world powers of that time up until this time. And so when we're talking about land back, there's an added layer of maybe there's an added layer to the situation that maybe complicates things for certain people and kind of increases our ability to succeed and to achieve this idea of land back as we move forward in the future. But I'll leave that for Jon to cover.
And aloha, this is Andre. I just want to jump in real quick, adding one thing that to everything Kaho'okahi said. What that all culminates in is we have what's sort of a unique situation for Hawaiian land, kingdom land. We have land title. We have land title. We have allodial title, royal patent, all of that together. And I hope that Jon can kind of unpack some of that and what it means.
Mahalo. Oh, 1 second, John. So mahalo Kahoʻokahi. Today is Lau Kuʻokoʻa, and really, I don't know if all of us really understand or see how this impacts our everyday lives, because our land title and our land title system still recognizes these kingdom documents, these rights to the land. One thing that they say about our land system in Hawaii is private property, the rules of private property, the notion that you can keep everyone off your land and keep it to yourself is not universally applicable in Hawaii, meaning we have rights to go onto private property for certain purposes. And that's a really difficult concept for people outside of us to understand, you know. But John has done just amazing work in your lifetime, John, between writing your book about how our land and how our people really lost that sovereignty. But also, John has been a fighter and engaged in the battle for the return of these lands to our people. And so we're really honored to have you here tonight, John. You're going to talk a little bit about what is the ceded lands, how does that work, why does that apply here, and when we're talking about public lands, because NDN and the Land Back campaign is specifically targeting these public lands. And so we have different categories of those public lands in Hawaii. And a lot of our struggles and our struggles for land back relate to these public lands as well. So mahalo, John. The floor is yours.
I'm okay now? You can hear? Good. First of all, I also want to thank Nick and Crystal Lorenzo for arranging this and for hosting such a wonderful webinar. And I'm really grateful to Kahoʻokahi for reign of Kiaʻi Kamena III. I'm going to have to take you back to the Mahele in order to really understand what we mean by these so-called ceded lands. What happens in 1843 is that it really demonstrates that the seizure of the country, because one British diplomat had a land dispute with the monarchy, convinces really the country, if they hadn't known this already, that they were going to have to do something about settling these differences of opinion with HULI, Europeans and Americans who were settled in Hawaii. And many of them had been renting, they purported to have bought lands. And what's important is that before 1848, there's no private property. All the land basically belonged to the people and to the chiefs in common. The kingdom's decision to basically separate out the use of the land and to actually give title was done in part to protect the kingdom's government from future seizures by European countries, but was also done to protect the Hawaiʻi, the Maka'aina, the people of the land who are not chiefs, to protect their existence on the land. And this is one of the most amazing things about the Mahele. And it was something that I didn't really understand when I wrote my book. It was something that really Professor Keanu Sai makes clear to all of us. The Mahele was intended to preserve the rights of all of our people on the land. And what it did between 1846 and 1848 was create a way for all of the land in Hawaii, which had no owner, no single owner. It permitted the crown, the king, Kahoʻokahi, to separate out his interests. It permitted around 257 chiefs, konahiki we call them, to separate out their interests and make claims on the land and agree who owned which lands. It provided the ability of, it provided for all of these konahiki, all of these chiefs, to pay a commutation, which basically was 1/3 of their land or 1/3 of the value of their land into a pot. And that pot would represent basically the crown's interest, not the king, not Kauikeaʻuli. He was a konahiki. He was claiming lands as a chief. They were claiming that 1/3 of the lands that each of these entities claimed for themselves would have to be paid to the crown, that would pay off the crown's interest. And once they did that, they were then able to claim their lands fee simple, and they were given royal patents. Um, the royal patents meant that these 257 chiefs owned their land fee simple because they paid the commutation. However, every deed that was issued to a chief came with the disclaimer, subject to the rights of native tenants. Housed within every piece of private property in Hawaii is this understanding that the maka'ainana, the ho'aina, at that point in time, in 1848, some 50,000 of our people had unextinguished rights to the land. Now, maka'ainana were also given the right to separate out their interests and make their claims, which some of them did. Not many, and they didn't claim much land. But essential in this operation was that even though the king owned, he claimed 2,000 acres of land, he surrendered 1,000 acres of land to the government, right? And by doing so, his lands were his private lands. The 256 chiefs, some of them surrendered a third of their acreage, some of them didn't, but all of that land together became government land. Maka'ainana, who did not claim lands under the Mahele in between 1846 and 1848, their lands went into government lands. So the government was the holder of really the unclaimed Maka'ainana lands, Ho'aina lands. If you understand all of this, then what you should see is that when the kingdom government decided to separate out and to make private lands available, they didn't just take care of the chiefs. They didn't just take care of the king. They made sure that the whole country, and that enshrined in law was this notion that all of the people had interest in the land, and that at the time of their choosing, they could separate those interests out. Maka'ainana purchased lands from government lands throughout the 19th century, right up until the taking of the country. They were able to purchase lands cheaply. And the chiefs themselves tended to be really, really generous in the use of their lands. One of our mo'i, one of our kings, who had a tremendous amount of land, Lilo, basically let Maka'ainana live on his lands free, um, almost at will. He did this so often that many of the HULI and government criticized him and said that he was not a particularly good steward of his land. But the queen, Liliuokalani, when she became queen and inherited the crown lands, when she inherited those lands, her plan as queen was to lease, to provide low leases to Maka'ainana for $1 for 10 acres. And she intended to push this through and would have done so, except that her kingdom was overthrown and she was removed of the ability to do this. The entire history of our kingdom was really sort of nested in that land, in how we set up land titles. One, to protect the sovereignty and the independence of the country, and two, to make sure that we provided for all of the people. Government lands were set up in order to basically pay the cost of government, but also to be a repository of lands for Maka'ainana to be able to obtain when the time was right. However, when the country was taken over in 1893 and taken over by this small cartel of American businessmen and sugar plantation owners, what they did was they took government lands and crown lands, conflated them together, and started calling them public land. They then they set up a small little committee to lease out lands, mostly to sugar companies, at very, very low rates. And we see a very different use of those lands once the HULI take over in 1893. The Queen protested against this, and she protested very, very specifically in a letter that she sent to the American government in 1897, when she says that neither the above named commission, she's talking about a commission set up by the United States, nor the government that sent it, the United States itself, was officially has ever received any such authority from the registered voters of Hawaii, but derives its assumed powers from the so-called Committee of
Kalama,
Public
John,
Safety. Yes.
can I ask you to do one thing so we can hear you better? On the right side of your screen, if you wave your mouse over it, you'll see a volume button on your, if you look
on
at
my
your
screen.
image.
Yeah.
And there's a volume button. If you can mute that, it'll help us hear you better.
Bring it all the way down.
Just click on it to mute it.
Okay. Looks like it's muted. Is that better?
Yes, much better. Thank you so much.
I'm sorry. To get back to the Queen's words, she says, none of these commissions, nor the government which made it, has ever received any authority from the registered voters of Hawaii, but derives its assumed powers from the so-called Committee of Public Safety, organized around the 17th day of January, 1893. And that said committee being composed largely of persons claiming American citizenship, and not one single Hawaiian was a member thereof. My people, about fight to destroy the independence of Hawaii by people. My people constitute 4/5 of the legally qualified voters of Hawaii, and excluding those imported for the demands of labor, about the same properties of the inhabitants. So what she's saying here in 1897, 4 years after the kingdom government was taken from her, is that our people have set up this country in a constitution. It provided private property rights and protections for all people, not just Native Hawaiians, not just the people who were the original inhabitants from the time of the Mahele all the way to the time the government was seized. And she said that at the time of the takeover, that takeover was only sponsored by fewer than 3,000 people. There were only about 100 actively involved in the takeover from the country, and they could not have done that without the United States. So this so-called republic holds our lands, holds the lands of the Queen, holds the government lands, and begins to use it for their own purposes, mostly to enrich themselves. At the time of the takeover by the United States, this was basically done by a resolution, a joint resolution passed by the Congress of the United States and the Senate in 1898, in June and then July. The real crux of this is that the United States made an attempt to annex the Kingdom of Hawaii, the Kingdom of Hawaii, in 1897. They had a bill of annexation that required a 2/3 majority vote in responded by having the Native Hawaiian political parties, Hui Aloha Aina and Hui Kalai Aina, they went from island to island and community to community, collecting signatures from everyone, from Hawaiians and from non-Hawaiians alike. And the petition basically said, we do not want to be annexed by the United States. We are an independent country. 2 petitions went to the Senate. And we have copies of one of those that contain 22,500 names. And the will of the people expressed in these 2 groups of petitions is undeniable. They did not agree to annexation. So when the U.S. tried to annex Hawaii in 1897, the vote in the Senate failed. They didn't have enough votes. So they pass a treaty, they pass instead a resolution that accepts the cession of the lands and the sovereignty from the Republic of Hawaii. And this is what the Queen is objecting to. You cannot accept the cession of our sovereignty and our land. A committee of people that was set up largely with the help of the United States and the U.S. military. The United States nevertheless does this, and part of what they do, the U.S. says, is that it replaces all of the existing laws of the kingdom with the laws of the United States. It says that the existing laws of the United States relative to public lands shall not apply to such lands in the Hawaiian Islands, but the Congress of the U.S. shall enact special laws for their management and disposition. They are talking here, when they say public lands, they're talking about the private property of the Queen, and they're talking about the government lands. And they have been pushed together. They are accepted by the United States as one entity. And it says that the Congress will make special laws. And it says, provided that all revenue from or proceeds of the same, these lands, except as regards such part thereof that may be used or occupied for the civil, military, or naval purposes of the United States, or may be assigned for the use of the local government, shall be used solely for the benefit of the inhabitants of the Hawaiian Islands for educational and other public purposes. Gone is the provision in the government lands that says that the maka'ainana unseparated land interests, which rest in the government lands, that is basically a forgotten provision of this. Because of this declaration, or actually I would say despite this declaration, when you go back to how the lands were originally constituted under kingdom law, maka'ainana rights to lands within the government and also our rights within private lands go undistinguished. And the last thing I want to say about this, and I'm to a better understanding of just how complicated land title and land use was in the kingdom. Just as the mahele was ending in 1848, actually in 1850, the king, Kauikeaʻuli, provided a list of rights that the tenants, the hoʻāina had, to all land in Hawaii, the rights to gather, the rights to water. And these rights basically are given in order to protect the ability of the people to be able to live on the land in perpetuity. The king also says, without any exception, that the hoʻāina's rights to land exist forever. They exist forever. And this is enshrined in our laws, which is why when we talk today about private property rights in Hawaii, they are incredibly complicated by the fact that we have these rights that go back to kingdom law. and that during the 1970s and 1980s, when the Hawaii State Supreme Court was overseen by the Chief Justice, William Richardson, he would continually go back to kingdom law as the foundation and basis for people's rights to the land today. And this is also why in 1894, a group of us sued the state in order to prevent the state from being able to sell any of the lands that were under its control. Because, and I think this is maybe one of the things I forgot to mention, the US federal government and a series of presidents after the takeover and after the territorialization of Hawaii, they made Hawaii a territory in 1900. Between 1900 and about 1920, and even afterward, one president after another would withdraw lands from these so-called public lands for military purposes and for parklands. So that's how Schofield gets created. That's how the lands around Pearl Harbor are made into military bases. That's where Hickam comes from. That's where Wheeler comes from. Shafter. The rest of the lands are supposed to be basically left to the territory to administer for public purposes, right? And so in 1959, when the United States makes Hawaii a state of the Union, it transfers to the state of Hawaii whatever lands aren't already taken over by the feds. And they are given to the state of Hawaii, transferred to the state of Hawaii, not given because the United States doesn't have title. They never paid for these lands. The only other way they could have gotten title for these lands would have been in conquest of the kingdom. And they didn't conquer Hawaii because Hawaii refused to fight the United States in 1893. We were not combatants. The Queen basically ceded the authority of the kingdom to the United States until such time that the US president and the Congress could review the actions of their military forces in Hawaii and return the sovereignty to her as she was entitled to, and as would have been correct under international law. The US does none of those things and instead pretends, for the next 100 years, that it has somehow acquired Hawaii's sovereignty and the title to the land legally until 1993. And in 1993, President Bill Clinton signs an apology to the Hawaiian people, saying, essentially in this apology, that the Hawaiian people never willingly relinquished their sovereignty or their lands to the US. And it was in part based on that apology that a number of us sued the state in 1994 to cease and desist from selling, exchanging, or transferring any of the lands under its control that were defined as ceded lands until there was some determination as to the native claim. It took, like years for this thing to unfold. We lost this suit in district court, but then it was overturned by the state Supreme Court in 2000. I think I've got that right. It was later than that. It was overturned by the Supreme Court in 2009. And then that was appealed to the US Supreme Court in 2010. I think I have those dates correct. The US Supreme Court did not overturn the state Supreme Court's ruling, which was favorable to us. What they said in 2010, 2011 was that the The state Supreme Court could not rest its decision on the apology bill because the apology was only a resolution. Sort of the same way that, the bill that allowed the United States to accept the sovereignty from the Republic and those lands back in 1898 was also a resolution. Anyway, they said this is only a resolution. You cannot base your decision on this. And it remanded the issue back. The state Supreme Court could have reheard it. They could have reconsidered. And that's what I believe they should do. However, the other plaintiffs and the Office of Hawaiian Affairs, which had also joined us as a plaintiff at an earlier time, made the decision to drop the case and withdraw as plaintiffs in exchange for some protections of ceded lands within the legislature. They depended on a legislative act essentially to try and protect the ceded lands from being sold. And I argued at the time, and I continue to argue, that the legislature should not have anything to do with the ceded lands because those lands belong to the Kingdom of Hawaii and to the Kingdom of Hawaii's descendants. And until that issue is settled, and it should really be settled in the courts, we are not protected by the legislature because that basically just simply is one more admission that somehow or another the state that was created by the United States, which is basically an extension of the territory, has rights, has legal authority over those lands. I'm sorry, I've taken a very long time, and I hope that this has been clear. Hawaiian lands were created, the legal title to Hawaiian lands was created in 1850 to protect the government of the kingdom and to protect the rights of the people on the land forever. And this is basically what we have to return to. And when we say land back, it also means, having an understanding of what our actual rights are in those lands. Our people really need to know that these lands belong to us and they belong to us in perpetuity. Anyone who comes to live in Hawaii, anyone who comes to make a business here, anyone who comes wanting to be a resident here needs to understand that the lands of Hawaii belong to the native people of Hawaii. And that's all there is to that.
Mahalo nui, Jon. I think that, what you said is really important. And one of the things that we talked about in conversation earlier was that we all, as Indigenous people across America, have different ways of getting to where we're at now. We have complex legal histories. We have complex land tenure histories. And I know that the Land Back campaign, one of the goals, like you said, Crystal, is really to connect these struggles. We may have different histories, but we have shared goals, we have shared demands, and we have shared outcomes that we want to see for Native peoples around the planet, really. And so we really mahalo you, Jon, for walking us through this complicated history. A lot of our people didn't grow up learning that, and I'm just glad to say that our keiki now, our children, are learning this history a lot sooner and a lot younger than we did. So our kids are asking us, when are we going to get our land back, Mom? And that consciousness at that age is so key. And so having this Land Back campaign, making those connections, helping us realize that we are really all connected, is one of the key components of this Land Back campaign and why we're doing this today. But I want to move into, and mahalo, Jon, thank you for being with us. I know your time is limited. Thank you so much for joining. We are also behind time because of my technical difficulties. So we're gonna move into the next portion of our talk, which is about a specific context for land back in Hawaii, which is our struggle over Mauna Kea, one of our most sacred places in Hawaii. And with that, we're going to turn to Shelley Muneoka. She is a board member of KAHEA, who has been engaged in this, along with Jon Osorio, but who has been engaged in this battle to protect our lands, to return those lands, for that land back for, I don't know, over a decade, Shelley, and has really been involved in many different aspects of our movement. And we're really grateful to her to be part of this today, and look forward to hearing from you, Shelley, about how does this relate to Mauna Kea specifically?
Aloha, Camille. Thank you so much. I'm super excited to be here with all of these amazing minds. And mahalo nui to NDN Collective. Nick, your opening when we were just talking about recognition, and just, it's complicated for Hawaii in terms of the idea of federal recognition and being a federally recognized tribe. And, the conversation today about realizing our own independence, our own sovereignty that lives inside of us, and that doesn't come from recognition from the federal government. Hearing you talk, your introduction today, Nick, really made me think about this is a space where we can engage as our Maori, that's our word for like I guess indigenous person, as Maori people, without having to wait for a federal recognition and all of the ball of wax that brings. So super excited, and mahalo nui for inviting us, including us, and for recognizing us, especially on Maku'oko'a. I'm gonna try and actually keep my part short because I actually wanted to have more time to talk story with each other. Most of the information I'm gonna share is out there in the webverse somewhere, in lots of different forms, but just so we can all kind of be on the same page and have common understanding and language, I just wanted to give a little bit of background to Mauna Kea, and the struggle to protect Mauna Kea from industrial telescope development. So I always like to start before we get into, the encroachment and the misuse of that space, to talk about the space itself. And so it's interesting, I just had a thought today. So sorry, the name Mauna Kea, in kind of a really basic, oversimplified maybe definition, people might think of it as a white mountain, because in Hawaii, snow is not very common, and it's one of the few places in Hawaii where you'll see snow. But you may hear another name for this place, Mauna Kea, and Wakea is our name for the sky. But what you also hear in the name Akea, Mauna Kea, is the sound of Akea, which is our word that means like spaciousness, open space. It's the quality of the sky. And this mountain is so tall, it's up in the realm of that open space of the sky. And that's important to think about its natural state and special quality of that space of Mauna Kea is that openness, and that's one of the things that we're fighting to preserve. And so, in the Hawaiian worldview, Mauna Kea is considered a wau akua, which is contrasted with the wau kanaka. So you may hear us use the word kanaka to describe people, human beings, and the akua, which is sometimes translated as a god. But the Edith Kanakole Foundation folks have this really useful definition of an akua that kind of takes us away from the Christian image of a god and a human being as a god, but instead defines akua as life-giving elements, natural elements. And so Mauna Kea is a space where those elements interact with each other and do their thing, basically, and that we understand that they need to be free and untainted to do what they do, and that's key for our life and living and wellness. And it's contrasted with a Kanaka, which is a place for human beings, and it's not. Mauna Kea is not a place where traditionally people would spend a whole lot of time. Just physically, there's not very much oxygen as compared to sea level, which is kind of a hint that it's not our space. But yeah, it's very harsh conditions, and when you are up there, or even if you observe from afar, you'll see all of those different aqua, holiahu, which is snow, lilinoi, which is the mist, waiau, which is a lake up there, as well as many other aqua. And so traditionally, people of high rank with very specific purposes would enter into that space temporarily, and they would do the work that they needed to do, and then they would descend. And unfortunately, that's not the current state of that space. And yeah, I think we have time on just tell like a brief story. So this is 2012, I think. I went up there with Auntie Deb Ward and Uncle Ku Ching and maybe Kela Fishoro was with us. But we were there for sunrise, to observe the sunrise. And from where we were standing, the sun rises from behind the Mauna. So when you're looking, it casts this huge shadow in front of you. And for a second, I thought I was looking at another mountain. But actually, it's the shadow of Mauna Kea cast by that sun. And so as we're waiting there in front of us, there's a cinder cone, a pu'u in front of us, and it's going to be the first point where that sun comes over and touches that pu'u, that cone. And so we're waiting with all this anticipation, and unfortunately, just as the sun comes over, there's a shadow cast by a telescope. And it was so jarring, even though I knew about the history of the telescopes there. I wasn't prepared. It was really kind of a heavy moment. And so from that, I'm going to transition into kind of this next phase, which was how do we get to this misuse and the situation now. So Mauna Kea still now, is considered quote unquote public land. And Jon just gave us an awesome and detailed explanation of this kind of myth of public land in Hawaii and what that means. Public land is Hawaiian land, but it's a specific category, and it's specifically conservation land, which has its own kind of rules and supposed to have special protections. And so in 1968, the State Department of Land and Natural Resources grants a lease to the University of Hawaii for 65 years, which for state leases, that's like the longest lease time that they'll allow, because they're not allowed to sell the land or encumber the land basically for more than 65 years. And what the deal is supposed to be is that they're supposed to collect quote unquote fair market rent for the use of public lands to compensate the public for their lack of access. And 20% of this fair market rent is supposed to go to the Office of Hawaiian Affairs in recognition of the special displacement of Hawaiians, which is, I mean, it's a bunch of shit. It's not enough, for sure. And is also rife with its own kind of problems, but we don't need to get into all of that. But instead of collecting fair market rent, they only pay $1 a year. And though that original master lease, that 65-year lease, was for a single observatory, since then 13 observatory complexes have been built, and their support structures, that means roads and electric lines and parking lots and all those things. So you can see on your screen here an image of what the summit looks like now. And so this is a space that traditionally did not have any permanent structures. And, you know, as ugly as this is, it's important to acknowledge that underneath each one of those structures is a foundation that had to be excavated and then poured in with cement. You know, and this is our most sacred place. So how the university did that was that they turned around and granted all of these subleases to other countries, to other universities. And again, they should have been collecting fair market rent, but they've collected also $1 a year or nothing at all. If you look at the subleases, some of them it says gratis, I don't know how to pronounce that, but it means free. And the way that they explain that is that they say that they're paid in telescope viewing time. So these other countries will build a telescope, and that they will pay UH in telescope viewing time, which does not meet that standard or the purpose of compensating, quote unquote, the general public, but specifically Hawaiians, for the lack of use because of this lease. One thing I wanted to note is, because the lease rent is so low, and there's kind of a claim from the state and the university that it's not about money. We're not making a whole bunch of money. We're not monetizing. However, I think this is maybe 2011. I'm not quite sure. It came out that Yale had paid $12 million for 15 nights over 10 years. So that comes out to $80,000 a night. And there's likely other agreements like that. And because of the arrangement, we don't see any of that revenue. And it's weird to talk about revenue because there's no amount of money that would make this right. But it's about the ways that it's incentivized for these other universities and other observatories to misuse this land. There's no reason for them not to. So that brings us to the current project that we've been fighting up against. And so I started working on this about 11 years ago now through KAHEA, which is the Hawaiian Environmental Alliance. And so what we're fighting now is called the 30-meter telescope, or TMT for short. And if it was ever built, it would be the tallest building on the island, 18 stories tall, so it's huge, 2 stories down into the earth. And the cost is now estimated at $2.4 billion. So it's very expensive, big money. And so when I started working on this, TMT had just submitted their conservation district use application, which is basically a special permit to build in a conservation district. And I was joining a group of aunties and uncles who had been fighting through the court system for about 10 or 15 years already at that point, who were successful at stopping any more development on Mauna Kea for 20 years, which I really want to shout out, because like Jon was describing the lawsuit that he was involved in, and we're also talking about like these direct actions and blockades, and it's so important to acknowledge that we need both and more and all. And so essentially, we went through this permitting process, we went through court challenges, and just like in the story that Jon and Kahoʻokahi shared about the annexation and the prolonged occupation of our country by the United States, that at a point it became clear that the state and the university were totally down to violate their own laws, and so that there's limitations to legal means. And it became apparent that there was imminent harm that would be irreversible. There is no putting back the top of a pu'u. And there's many spaces on Mauna Kea that are currently in that state right now. There's no putting back excavated earth. And it was apparent that was imminent. And so in 2015 was when people were moved to do everything they could, use their bodies and be in the road. And, there were many arrests throughout that year, I think on 3 different occasions. And again, coupled with court challenges, but a little more time. And, so even throughout this more recent period, it was still both. I kind of think of it like 2 legs, like you can get by with one or the other, but when you have both, it really helps moving forward. And then basically we come to last year, at the end of 2018, we lost kind of our last appeal on that big conservation district use permit. And it became apparent that they announced their construction start date again, and people showed up, specifically our elders, our kupuna, sat in that road, and it's freezing. Well, for us, I know maybe compared to other places, it's not so much, but for us, it was freezing. And there they were, just all bundled up in their sleeping bags and their folding chairs, and they just weren't going to let it happen. And so almost 40 people were arrested, mostly people in their 70s and 80s, people in wheelchairs, people being carried out. And, and those images and that commitment, that kind of like values, I'm going to live my values, that was so inspiring to people. And there was a huge upswell both in Hawaii and from all our relations beyond Hawaii as well. And so, yeah, that's that's an ongoing thing. And it's so, sorry, I know I'm going a little bit long here. I'll try and like wrap it up so we can have a conversation. But it's so interesting to me that we're talking today on la pu'oko'a. One of our words, or one of the definitions for oko'a, is to be separate, to like stand apart. And to me, that's also about making space. And we talked about akea and spaciousness in that beginning, and it just feels very fitting. Yeah, so I guess the last thing I'll say, maybe just for some clarity and for some framing, to kind of pull together some different concepts that we talked about. Like if you think about the shape of a mauna, and we often use this shape, right, like a triangle. And if you think about different levels of consciousness, kind of maybe down at the bottom, you can think of Mauna Kea as state conservation land. If you're living inside of the world where you believe the state of Hawaii is a legitimate entity, okay, that's where some of us are. And even in that picture, Mauna Kea's conservation land and special protections. If you kind of come up a little bit in your understanding, and you understand Mauna Kea as Hawaiian Kingdom and government lands, and in that context that Jon and Kahoʻokahi shared, you understand the laws and the violation that we're already talking about there, and whose land this is, essentially. And at the very top of that understanding, that concept of awakua that we talked about earlier, and a sacred space. No matter where you are along these different levels of understanding, it's uncontested that Mauna Kea is sacred and special, and that there's laws that govern all along those levels of understanding, and they're being violated at all of those levels. And so it's really clear, and it's why it's a issue that's powerful, because it's a microcosm of so many other phenomena. And so it's been super exciting to think about it in the context of LANDBACK. And I want to stop talking so we can talk to each other more. But mahalo nui.
Mahalo, Shelley. I want to just get over to Nick and Crystal to tie in. You talked about how Mauna Kea inspired a big uprising by Hawaiian people. And it's definitely by far the biggest one in my lifetime, many of our lifetimes. And what is it about these spaces, and this is for Nick and Crystal, the Black Hills, Mauna Kea, why are we prioritizing these lands for land back in this campaign? Because in Hawaii, we're talking about 1.2 million acres that we could be going after just in terms of public lands. But there are certain lands that are priority and key for our people, and I'm sure there are for all of our peoples across the continent. So Nick, if you could talk a little bit about how the Black Hills fits in, why that was the starting point for the campaign, and any other parallels you see with Mauna Kea.
Well, I think the man the parallels is the spiritual power that was just that was just being referenced. I mean, we have a responsibility to enact the spiritual laws that have been passed down to us through our generations. It is part of our identity. It's part of who we are. Who are we if we don't do that? Who are we if we don't act upon the spiritual laws that have been instilled in us, and that the ancestors and the spirits today are asking us to act upon, protecting our lands? And the Chisapa or the Pahasapa, the Black Hills, is the center of the Osheti Shakoi. It's a spiritual place that we have that we go to. It's the place that we pick our medicines. It's the place that we do our Wiwang Wat Chi, our sun dance. And so when Sister was talking about the Mauna and about the power that exists there, when these spiritual laws are being broken, then we have to do everything possible to protect them. And so those are parallels. I think the other parallels is the indigenous sovereignty and land rights movement in Hawaii has been powerful and multi-generational, and that the rising at Mauna Kea, for many of the relatives there, it was a continuation of a long-term land struggle, and that is also a comparison to the Black Hills. The Haisapa in the Black Hills is one of the longest existing legal battles in the history of the United States. The Sioux Nation versus the United States government. And the other parallels that we see is that no matter what colonial processes that we go through, and John mentioned this earlier, Kahoʻokahi mentioned this earlier too, we go through all of the public commenting periods, um, you know, court systems. But no matter what, those court systems always end up not on our side. No matter how many times, it's because they're colonial constructs of white supremacy that have to be fucking dismantled. That is the reality of it. And so I think that part of the land back movement and where this ties in is that we're done asking for permission. We're done just saying we're going to hope one day that the constitution of these colonial governments is going to, give us our land back. The truth is, we ain't getting our land back unless we take that shit back. And the truth is, there's going to be logging in the Black Hills and our mountains being blown up and telescopes on Mauna Kea unless our people rise up. And we have to take huge amounts of risk, but we're not alone in taking those risks. The same spiritual power that we felt on July 3rd when we went to the sacred Haisapa is the same spiritual power that I've seen all of the relatives talk about in Hawaii. And that spiritual connection, that's the thing for me that gives me like no fear when it comes to standing up for that, because we cannot expect to get outcomes from a colonial system that was designed to take our land in the first place. And that's what comes back to why these demands, if you really think about the demands that we talk about in the land back campaign around defund, dismantle, return, and consent, put that in the context of everything that was shared here today and this evening, and think about how that can be used to continue to make comparisons and strip systems down and dismantle systems so that we're not doing this forever. Because we have every right to continue our ceremonies on our land and to continue living out our natural laws, and we have to do so uh, because our children are watching, our families are watching, and it's part of our duty to do that. So I see all kinds of comparisons. So I'm looking to throw down at the Mauna whenever the time is right, and I'll actually be able to come hopefully this time, Brother Andre.
Yeah, yo, I want to add to that a little bit as well. I was fortunate enough. We talked a little bit about Indian Collective being the first group to show up on the Mauna, and it was because of Indian Collective that I was able to show up there. Nick's like, "What do you need? Like, what do you need to be there to support?" And I was like, "I just need a plane ticket." I was like, "I just need a plane ticket to be there." Andre invited me, and so I showed up, and we made it happen. And that actually is probably what started my relationship with Indian Collective officially, and what ended up leading to like right here, right now with the Land Back campaign and directing that in this space. And so our movements are deeply, deeply connected, right? In ways that like we keep saying, like these are long legacies of organizing that we're coming into, right? And so many generations have sacrificed before us, and there's so many different comparison points. Even just when I recall when Andre was actually arrested, and they represented themselves in the Hawaiian language, and it was really powerful because my father was actually in the same position, and he defended our homelands against people doing, you know, crazy, weird cult like stuff on our territories and our lands. And him and another Northern Cheyenne defended themselves in the Cheyenne language in a Cheyenne courtroom, and were said that they were in contempt of court because they were speaking in the Cheyenne language and the judge would not recognize them. And so I remember how powerful that was and how connected it was. And there's so many examples of that we can go back, and just between, you know, the friendship between Andre and Camille and Kahoʻokahi and Nick and myself, we can name all of those little points of comparison that are the same, right? It's the same struggle. And I recall speaking at an event, I'm probably going to butcher it. Is it Lahoʻinuiākea? At an event in Hawaii. And I was given the opportunity to share on a panel there. And I distinctly remember saying very specifically, like, your struggle is my struggle. And when I win, you win. And that is one of the core organizing principles with the LANDBACK campaign, is that we hold that when we go to spaces and when we organize and when we support and we deeply invest in those relationships. And then, you know, kind of moving over to a more, you know, political analysis framework with the LANDBACK campaign as well, I just want to bring up, you know, we operate, when we talk about land back, like, we take it all the way back to the beginning on when it comes to our lands, right? In that, it's like the doctrine of discovery, and really looking at the legal mechanism that came in and then opened the door for colonization to start, and for us to start being physically removed from our lands by the US military, and for that to all happen. And then recognizing that process, of trying to gain access to the land and to resources, and the removal of the original peoples there by the US military, is a template. It's a template that was then used and placed on other nations overseas in other lands to remove those original stewards from their lands to gain access to that land and those resources. And that is what we experience today as US imperialism, right? And so our struggles, if we are going to win, have to be connected. We have to do this together. It has to be a collective effort, and we have to hold a collective vision where we truly do mean it when we say that your struggle is my struggle. And we have to embody that every step of the way. And I feel like this conversation here is just, it's one of many that we will be continued to have with our relatives in the Hawaiian Kingdom, and that we will be deeply invested in as we move forward. You know, is how do we show up? We may not always have the right steps. We may not always know what the next space is going to look like, but we're invested in figuring that out together. And so I think that it's really important to remember even just the political analysis and how that connects us, along with the spiritual connections and relationships and the organizing relationships and the narrative relationships that exist between Mauna Kea and our struggles, you know, even at the Black Hills. But I just wanted to add that piece there.
Mahalo, Crystal. I got a question I want to ask Jon to kind of elaborate on, building off what Nick was talking about. Oh, and just to clarify, that was Kahoʻokahi and Kalekoa who defended themselves in court in Olelo, Hawaii, in Hawaiian language. Unfortunately, I'm not there yet. My Olelo is, we say, na vali vali weak, but getting there someday. It would be my goal to defend myself in Olelo, Hawaii. Nick talked about, you know, we can't just wait for the Constitution to suddenly work, or for friendly politicians who, you know, have some sense of goodwill to look out for us. We have to look out for ourselves. But Nick talked about the legal system, that, you know, we spin our wheels in their legal system. And that got me, just kind of cued me in. Oh, we lost Jon. Shucks, I wanted Jon to elaborate a little bit on, in his book, Jon talks about that the settlers have had an advantage because they came with their legal system, right? Their judiciary system, their land court system, and that they were very well versed in how to play this game because they made the rules and they control the rules, and the rules can change. John wrote about that in his book, Dismembering La Hui, and I wanted him to kind of add a little bit to how their legal system is designed and set up to empower them and disempower us. We don't win in their courts. We make progress primarily through direct action, but I wanted to say, so since John's we lost John, I'll ask Camille, our moderator, who has a legal background. Camille was an attorney for the Native Hawaiian Legal Corporation for 15 years, to elaborate, Camille, a little bit on the legal system and how it really is designed to work against us, particularly around land. I wanted to ask for a little bit of insight around adverse possession and quiet title, because those two mechanisms are the continuation or continue to contribute to the dispossession of our land. Adverse possession, quiet title, Camille.
Mahalo, Andre. And actually, this somewhat relates to some of the questions that we're seeing in the chats. They ask about why is the United States Supreme Court ruling on issues of Hawaii if they don't have jurisdiction. They also ask what arguments can Kanaka use in the Supreme Court to win our case. And I think what's important for us to understand, and I think this is probably common with your people too, Crystal and Nick, is that we put a lot of faith in the court system. We put a lot of faith in justice will prevail. But if we understand what Andre's talking about, what Nick talked about, that these systems that we're trying to dismantle are not designed to bring us justice. So when we talk about adverse possession, it's a way to Andre, can you mute your mic, please?
Sorry.
Yeah. There's a way that our lands were continued to be lost. So the overthrow, the dispossession of our peoples, it didn't happen 150 years ago and now we're here today. It has continued to happen over all this time and continues today in these lawsuits over quiet title, basically deciding who is the real owner of these lands today. And one way private property owners and land developers, sugar companies who are now become real estate companies, one way they can get title to our lands even today is by claiming adverse possession, meaning they have used the land, excluded our people for over 20 years. In the past, it was as short as 10 years. And that was a way to quicken the process of getting land. And so that is one mechanism, quiet title. What does that mean? It just means, like I said, we're looking at lands that are still our ancestral lands today. Our people own them. In some cases, the title is split between hundreds of family members. And one person comes in, one company comes in and asks the court to say they are the true owner. And part of that is saying, basically, we've dispossessed the families. We've occupied this land. We've planted sugar. We've planted pineapple. And now we want to develop it and we want the title to it. And you need to recognize us as the owner. So I think the real key to both of these things is that it has continued to happen in the judicial system from the time the judicial systems were created, and they are happening today. There are still lawsuits over these lands. Our people are still losing land. So as we're fighting to win or to get lands back, especially public lands, we are still fighting hard to stop losing private lands for our people. And I imagine that is universal. You know, our peoples are just struggling to survive, you know. And it is the after effects of these systems that still need to be dismantled because they were not designed to work in our favor. And if we understand that, then we realize that it almost doesn't matter to some extent what arguments we make. what are better arguments we can use in the Supreme Court? The Supreme Court of the United States is exercising some jurisdiction over Hawaii because they took it, because we have a legal history that says that shouldn't have happened, but it did. So at some point we have to confront just the sheer power that we face. And part of that power, I believe, is connecting with one another. That for us is our shared power. And I'm gonna try to bring in another question. There's something, Nick, that you said that I think is really key in this campaign. The idea of land back and about private owners returning land to our people. Sorry. It's really about, you mentioned repairing relationships, repairing that wrong. And I wanted to ask you to talk a little bit more about that, because what we face here in Hawaii when we talk about land back is a fear that people who live here, people who have private property, are going to, lose their land. They're going to lose something. But I think that concept of repair is really important. So if you could elaborate on that for us.
Oh yeah, Camille. I think well, this is a complicated one. You know, you cannot have repair without having reciprocity. It's got to be both ways. It is not on us as indigenous people who have had our land taken from us and our culture attacked to be the one to come to the table to offer to offer peace and to offer repair. That's on the United States government. That's on the colonizers. That's on the folks who are currently benefiting from the systems that are currently in place, because the impacts of our land being stolen from us and their acquiring of the very land that they sit on, they are direct beneficiaries from the plight of our communities and our people. And that's why, that's why I think that part of our responsibility as indigenous people and organizers and activists and folks on the front lines is to force the issue. Because right now, they ain't coming to the table for repair. They ain't coming to the table. You have to build the table. You have to force that table to be in place. And that's why I'm a big advocate for land occupations and occupations of land, because the reality is, when we have legal right to the land already, when we have moral, spiritual, natural law right on our side, when we do land occupations, then it's way more than 9/10 of the law. Uh, and so I think that, and it forces the issue. And I can't reiterate enough that we have to force the issue. And there's a lot of different ways that people can fight for land back, through the court system, through purchasings of land, through all of these things. But part of land back is to change the narrative. So for white folks out there who are all over, Hawaiian lands, Lakota lands, everywhere. When we say land back, don't fear us. It's an invitation. It's an invitation for what repair could look like. But know that repair, there is not even a possibility of repair unless we're talking about returning lands back into indigenous hands. And and so fundamentally, you know, the reality is some people get scared, but for there to be repair, the status quo has to be upset. We have to upset the status quo. But we need allies, we need comrades, we need relatives. We don't just need allies, we need accomplices who believe and want to fight alongside us, and have the courage to stand up to the system of white supremacy that they currently are benefiting from. And when we can have real conversations like this, then we can start having conversations about repair. because the act of getting land back into indigenous hands would mean that repair happened. It would mean that there was a pathway to reconciliation. Reconciliation and repair is a byproduct of actually shifting change in the current structures that are in place. And so I would encourage folks to get uncomfortable. I mean, get comfortable being uncomfortable, because we've been uncomfortable for about 500 fucking years, you know? And the reality is, if we're going to change things, then all of us have to get a little bit uncomfortable. We have to push our limits. And I think that every indigenous person and every indigenous ceremony I ever got to participate in my life, when there's sacrifice, when there is commitment, the fruit of that provides healing to the land and to the people. And that's what I would say to our relatives that are fearful of this movement. That when you actually suffer through with one another, the impact that can truly have, the fruit that can bear for families and for healing, and to know that you committed to something bigger than yourself is powerful. And so those are the things I would say about what repair looks like, and what reparations look like, and what ultimately what land back looks like.
Right on, Nick. I think that's just super important for everyone out there to understand, both our people and non-indigenous other people, not to be afraid that this is about, we have to create relationships. We can't just continue to fight or we get nowhere, right? And another thing you said that I think is absolutely critical is without repair, you can't have repair without reconciliation. So I think it was Jon talked about the 1993 apology resolution by the United States government, Bill Clinton, to Hawaii. Apologized, acknowledged the land was taken without our consent, and did nothing. Gave no land back. There was no reconciliation. There was no reparations. And that was almost 30 years ago now. And so sometimes there are some theories that when you apologize, but you don't actually take the next step, and that's the easy part. For some people it's hard to apologize, but sometimes, that apology happened. That was comfortable, maybe a little uncomfortable for the U.S., but it never got so uncomfortable that they actually returned some land, that they actually returned some power. And so nothing has changed fundamentally. And that's why we're still fighting. But Crystal, I wanted to turn to you with one of the questions from our viewers, asked how we in Hawaii can support Land Back and the campaign.
Yeah, I mean, that's a good question. Whenever I get the question about how folks can support land back in general, I always put it back on folks to look around them and what land back struggle is happening around you locally. And that is a way to engage with us, because how we're moving is really collectively like that. It is our goal to be able to move that. But also just on tangible things, I mean, landback.org is our website. We sign up there for all the notifications and ways to get engaged with us. The other piece is the petitions. We have several petitions right now that we're pushing to demand the closure of Mount Rushmore and the return of all public lands in the Black Hills back to the original stewards. We have more petitions that are demanding the dropping of the charges for Nick and myself and all of the other land defenders that were arrested on July 3rd. So that's another way to engage. In obviously just staying involved with Land Back Now, and we will be launching Land Back U probably early 2021. And so stay tuned for that as well, because we're actually hoping to circle back on this conversation specifically and expand it so we can really dive into deeper conversations, because we haven't even touched based on the militarization, right, and the impacts of the U.S. military in Hawaii. And so we're hoping to expand this conversation out on Land Back U, which will be more of a university, deeper conversation type structure. And so just stay involved with those pieces, follow NDN Collective on all the social medias. Those are kind of the main ways to, tangibly get involved right now, but also just encourage folks to be engaged in your own community around everything land back and support the efforts that are currently happening right now, right next to you, is the best way that I think you can be involved.
I just want to add to that too. I think that the question is maybe not so much how do we support the land back campaign, but more so how do we become part of it? Yeah, how do we become a collaborator in this so that we're not supporting the land back campaign. We're using the land back campaign as a platform for our efforts to restore stolen lands to Hawaiian hands. And I think one answer for that to me is to keep an eye out. We're going to be working closely with NDN Collective. It's our goal, and we have plans. They're kind of loose right now, but they'll firm up. But it's our goal to bring NDN to Hawaii. We want to plan a direct action camp. We want to have other events here with NDN in collaboration with NDN to build on our relationship and our collective struggle. And to move into that reparations and ultimately restoration. And we have to be patient, and we have to be innovative and use our imagination. We cannot get caught up in dogma. We have a lot of we've been organizing independence and sovereignty, around sovereignty, independence issues here in Hawaii, for many years. And we have to have patience. There's new people coming in and understanding sort of occupation theory and sort of the history of our situation. And people tend to get dogmatic about language, because Keanu Sai said, "Oh, don't use indigenous." Maybe at the UN, indigenous has a certain definition that's contrasted with Aboriginal. We understand this, but when we're talking to our people, we cannot assume that they're clued into all of these fine details, and some of them are theoretical. We have to be able to, speak comfortably and loosely. Just because we use the term indigenous when we're communicating with our Turtle Island relatives, it doesn't mean that we don't understand the analysis at the UN level and what that means in terms of having achieved a recognized functioning government, being Aboriginal peoples with recognition versus indigenous, sort of not having recognition or functional government. We know all these things. We don't have to be schooled on these things, but we're also not dogmatic and binary in our understandings and how we navigate politics and how we navigate the education of our people. So for me, we got to be real careful about the dogma, the binary thinking, and be able to reimagine and exercise our own self-determination. One last thing I want to talk about real quick, because we're talking about land back. I just want to give a shout out, acknowledgement, recognition to one of the big land back issues happening right here in Hawaii as we speak, on the west side of Maui, in the Lahaina region, Kauaula, Ke'emoku Kapu, and the Lahaina Ohana, all the ancestral people who have ancestral ties to that land are occupying it right now as we speak. There's land occupations going on right now in Hawaii. I would say Maui right now is at the forefront of that. I want to acknowledge Ke'emoku Kapu and his leadership in Kauaula. He's a good friend of ours. He's occupying land, and he's teaching other people how to occupy land and how to utilize their palapala, their land title, to attempt to work against the system through occupation with your title in hand. So I just want to acknowledge that because they're doing great, tremendous work there. So let's continue to build. Let's continue to organize, imagine, to dream big, and work together towards those common goals.
Well, and to that end, Andre, as the director of the Land Back campaign, what can I do to support y'all in your efforts for land back? To me, that's why it was funny when we came into this. Like, that's what's important to me is how can I support y'all? How can I show up for you? So yeah, so I appreciate that question.
Yeah, I wanted to add to that question. I know we're probably getting really close on time, but I wanted to add something about land back. When we say land back, like nobody owns it. Like land back, like if you're indigenous and native, or if you're Hawaii, wherever you're from, like land back's in your heart and your spirit already, and that it's a meta narrative, like it's a narrative, right? So use land back, use the language land back in your efforts, in the efforts that you're doing to revitalize your language, to reclaim your lands, to reclaim your power. Because the one cool thing about using a narrative is that as indigenous people, we're spread out all over. So we have solid, strong people in Hawaii and Lakota territory and Northern Cheyenne territory and these different places. And that land back is a meta narrative that we can use to unify our people and to show that indigenous people are a force to be reckoned with, whether you're in the Kesapa, or you're at Mauna Kea, or you're on the frozen tundra at Standing Rock. That when we have meta narratives, when people start seeing land back in Hawaii and Alaska and Mexico and Canada and so-called, these different places, that it shows that our people, that we have collective power. And if we have collective power, then we can have collective liberation. So land back, it's not a club. It's not something you can sign up and join, right? It's something that you can do in your communities. But when you do what you do, when you throw down on your land occupations, when you throw down, to you, whether you're testifying, use some of the narrative language, because language is power. And start weaving land back into the way in which you communicate to the colonial white supremacist structures that we are tearing down. Also use the narrative to inspire change in your community, and to inspire what your movement wants and needs. Because I think that if indigenous people and young people all over the place are yearning to be a part of something bigger than themselves, and this is an opportunity to do that. And so the line, I mean, the line back movement can be absolutely alive and well in Hawaii. And the more that we share this language, and build this language with each other, the more that we can deepen those connections, and we can build collective power. Because it's when we build collective power that these systems that we're fighting begin to crumble. And so I can't emphasize enough about how important a meta narrative is. Think about our Black brothers and sisters. Black lives matter, therefore shit needs to change. Black lives matter, therefore dot 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 dot. What is it? Things need to change. We are going to demand change. And what Black Lives Matter movement has meant for our Black brothers and sisters is similar to what land back can mean for our indigenous brothers and sisters and relatives everywhere. And so I ask folks to really think about that, and think about the power of meta narratives.
Nick and Crystal, real quick, along those lines, can you guys share with us a little bit about what happened when you folks launched the Land Back campaign? Crystal had mentioned to me that from places, faraway places like Palestine, South Africa, they were reaching out because they see the value of this common campaign and meta narrative. Can you share a little bit about that?
Yeah, I mean, right now I'm trying to hold everything that has come at us since we launched the campaign. I'm in deep relationship with a lot of Palestinian organizers and relatives that have been fighting for their lands in the same way, right? And what I'm finding is that land back looks very different, as we know just from this entire conversation, in all of these spaces globally. But everywhere where there is corporatism, right? there are indigenous people that have been displaced from their lands and separated from their lands and being impacted. And so for me, you know, the Black Hills is our starting point. It is our cornerstone. And it helps keep us spiritually grounded and guided. And land back is like one of those meta narratives that Nick was just now speaking to, that is a global issue. And it is something that I feel like can resonate with these movements globally. You know, like we said, I mean, folks were reaching out to me from South Africa, from Palestine, and wanting to engage in those conversations of what does that look like for their communities and for their peoples. You know, we're having, even just within Turtle Island, right? Alaskan corporations look very different than Plains tribes, right? With our treaties, and that looks very different than California in missions and the way that they were impacted by colonization, and that looks very different than the Pueblos in their structures and their systems that they have in place. That looks very different in the global South, in the way that colonization and U.S. imperialism and corporatism has played out and impacted communities globally. All looks different, but at the core of all of it is our fight to reclaim our relationship to the land. And for me, that is like the biggest piece that I've seen come from the Land Back campaign, is that it is one of those campaigns that is a global narrative, and it is a global struggle. And if we can align ourselves and work collectively, like, we're gonna win. There's just no questions asked about that. Like, we are powerful and aligned. We are that much more powerful, and we will win. We will get land back. But Nick might have some pieces for that too.
Yeah, to expand on that, and to, as we wrap up here, and folks are like trying to wrap their mind around land back. So here's something everybody could do, and I encourage anybody who's out there to do this in your language, if you have, if you speak your language, and then if you don't, go to five young people. Go to five young people and say, what does land back mean to you? Go to five elders and say, what does land back mean to you? What you will find is powerful. The answers to what you need to do to engage in the land back movement already lives within your people. It's already there, guaranteed. Because the one thing I noticed about land back for me, when I started seeing it and hearing it, I was like, oh, you know what that means to me? That means some shit to me. You know, that all of a sudden, that means my language. That means my ceremonies. That means, that means, you know, getting my brothers and sisters out of jail and prisons. That means tearing down the system that has, you know, that has oppressed our people. And the answers lie within there. And if you ask those questions to the people in your communities and you act upon the answers that come out of that question, well, that's, you're done not only, you know, built a meta narrative, you've done added to the land back movement. So like, I think it's there. I mean, I think that there, that even the words land back in this language, it's a connector, and there's spiritual power. There's spiritual power there. That's why we use the land back language and narrative when we took the stand at Mount Rushmore. Even though what we did there wasn't a protest, what we did there is we made a stand. We stood in our own power on our own land. We held ceremony in that spaces, but under and connected through a meta narrative. And people all across this nation, from all walks of life and throughout nations around the world, they're looking for identity. They're looking to be a part of something bigger than themselves. And so that would be the thing that I encourage folks to do, because I think that if you ask those questions and you act upon them, all of a sudden you'll be all up in the land back movement.
Mahalo, Nick. I know we're getting pretty much at the end of time, but I did want to go back to Kahoʻokahi just briefly. You know, we talked about what are some things that people can do in Hawaii to engage in this campaign.
Did you? Can everybody hear me?
I can hear you, but plus some extra sounds too.
Okay, well I didn't, but it sounded in Hawaii. What land back, what that would mean different, and what are those, and I think the for is being able to realize it before it happens, to see it, dream it in order to make it happen. Put our in what all the time. What would it be if another law? What would it be like? What would it be?
Shelley, I think into that, I know we're having some technical difficulties with Kahi's audio, but I don't know if you or Andre feel comfortable answering that question of what are some ways to get engaged there locally.
Sorry about that, folks. Can everyone hear me now? I think we had some wires crossed. Kahoʻokahi, your question came off with really bad audio, kind of robotic. We couldn't make out what you were saying. Crystal, can you you had the same sound as well. Can you restate that, Crystal?
Yeah, Camille was asking Kaho'okahi, what are ways that folks can engage locally there in the struggle around Mauna Kea and just local struggles around land back in general.
Okay, Kaho'okahi, I think on your window, bottom right hand, your personal window, there's a speaker. Click on that, turn that off. I think that was causing the problem. And maybe
it's
yeah. Okay, sorry, Kaho'okahi, you're coming in very garbled. Can everybody hear me pretty good? I'll try to answer the question. Okay, so how can people get engaged in land back here in Hawaii? Well, I know that NDN has a toolkit, right? That's a start. You can check out the NDN Collective website. They have a whole land back section that breaks down a lot of what the campaign is about, how it works. There's the toolkit with different graphics. But I think that what makes sense for us here in Hawaii is that we maybe work with NDN to develop maybe our own toolkit specific to Hawaii, to create graphics and visuals and different mechanisms that we can use that, you know, that are maybe a little more specific to our issues and our political history and our politics, etc. But as Nick said, you know, let's start using land back. Let's just start using that as a slogan, as a hashtag, as a consciousness. I think that's, as a first step, that's a good start, and we'll continue to organize and be vigilant for efforts that we're going to be organizing in the future around land back in collaborations with NDN. But at the end of the day, I think Nick said it in the best, that nobody's coming to rescue us. We have to rescue ourselves. The U.S. Constitution, for all of its so-called eloquence, is not protecting us and our land. So we have to take the matters into our own hands. I've talked about this a lot over many years, that our big progressive wins for the Hawaiian community have always come through direct action, not through legislation. Yeah, and we can look at Kahoʻolawe being put as actually an example for land back. It's not the best, but it's better than anything that I've seen so far. Kahoʻolawe, the island, 7 miles by 11 miles, was a 25-year Hawaiian political struggle that resulted in the island sort of being taken out of the state land inventory and put in a public trust. And it's defined by HRS Hawaii Revised Statute 6K-9. You can look it up. 6K-9 says that Kahoʻolawe will be placed in a trust until such a time that a recognized Hawaiian sovereign entity is established. That's important. And that can be sort of a model for us. Again, not the best model, but it's progress, right? Kahoʻolawe is out of the state inventory. It's being managed by largely a Hawaiian organization. But to me, at the end of the day, direct action gets the goods, man. Direct action. We have to do what is necessary to protect our land. And if that means occupying, getting arrested, organizing for a collective power, bringing our kupuna in who, as we saw on the Mauna, are willing to support us and willing to take the lead. We need to really honor that and appreciate those commitments. But direct action, I think, is something that I would encourage everyone to learn better, to understand better. There's a methodology, there's technique, there's strategy, there's theory, there's analytics, all built in within nonviolent direct action. And that is what has given us progress from Kahoʻolawe to Waukeleo to Mauna Kea. Of course, there's no TMT on the Mauna right now because of direct action. We can look at other examples. Waihole Waikane stopped the big development there. We can look at direct action in Maui at the Ritz-Carlton Ka'anapali, where they were going to build on Honokahua and unearth over 1,000 ancient burials. And it was literally hopping the fence. I'll use that term, hopping the fence, that led to the exposing of that issue and the juxtaposition and the forcing the community to really look at that and pick a side. And that's what it boils down to. We have to pick a side, and whether we're going to maintain, this, being American, forced, Americanization, or are we going to think about something better? Yeah, and think about liberation and ea for our people. Shelley, any thoughts on that? I want to expound.
Just the last thing that you said about ea, and we heard that word in the other holiday that the lanui that Kahoʻokahi shared about la hoʻihoʻi ea, and that concept for us of sovereignty, and but that it also has this kind of energy of rising and self-determination. It's kind of like comes from within, and it's a movement of ascension, basically, standing up, that kind of action. And LANDBACK very much has that, and I think it's so powerful when we're asked about like what you can do and how you can get involved. As some of the language that other folks have used is it's a consciousness, right, which means that it can be very personal, and it can be, so it has to be inside of you and it has to be outside of you with community, with other people as well. So if that means for your personal situation, maybe doing some research, family history about where were your ancestral lands, what happened to it. We talked about that there's a land tenure system in Hawaii during the kingdom time. Like, if you've never gone to look about your family's land, maybe start doing that. There's a lot of organizations that are doing things on Ainan. If you're not on your ancestral lands anymore, I think it's so important to just make a connection and to relearn and be with Akua and Aina again. And, it changes you. But not only to do that, but with this particular consciousness is everything. It's a shift in the lens and in how you interact with your whole world.
Right.
And or I guess one other specific thing, because this came up like during a lot of the Black Lives Matter stuff and people talking about like, yo, I gotta do some homework. And we talked about, you know, all the different ways that colonization and corporatism and militarism has played out like globally across the world. And just like that, in the same ways, resilience and creativity and the ways that people have innovated to survive are out there too. And we need to learn about that, take a page from their book. And like Nick is talking about, that meta narrative
Right.
is so powerful.
And I think I know that we need to wrap up, but I just had a thought. One way to really, one simple way, and a lot of people are doing it to engage in land back consciousness also, is real simple. Malama'aina, caring for the land, putting the land back into its production. If there were food production systems established, malama'aina is first basic step, and have that consciousness. As my friend and teacher, mentor, Kalekoa Kaʻeo, has said many years ago, in a very powerful way, before the land can be returned to Hawaiians, Hawaiians must return to the land. And what he's talking about is our consciousness and the decolonizing of the capitalist mind, that the land is ours for making money or for profit. And we need to really return to the land in terms of our relationship, that kinship relationship, and that understanding that we are the land is us, we come from the land. And so I think that's a good start for land back, for everyone, is to nurture and cultivate that consciousness. I'm going to hand it back to Camille for the wrap up.
Mahalo. Hopefully my audio is okay. Can you hear me okay?
Yep.
Great. I just really want to mahalo everyone for your time and attention to these issues. We could talk probably all day, every day, for a long time with our relatives. Nick, we lost Crystal. Her audio went down, and John had to go. But I really want to mahalo also the media and the tech team behind this for sticking with us, for hanging in there, and for helping us to make this happen. So mahalo, Nick. We look forward to future conversations with NDN, with Land Back specifically, and to host more of these panels in Hawaii. We try to fit a lot in a small space, but these issues are big, and there's a lot in there. So mahalo, everyone. Mahalo, Shelley, Kaho'okahi, Andre, Nick, everyone in behind the scenes. And we just want to say goodnight to everyone. Thank you so much, and stay tuned. Mahalo.
Aloha la ku'oko'a.
Yeah.